Jake Hart had always imagined that life in the countryside would be simpler. When he left the suffocating pulse of city life behind, trading a cramped apartment and endless traffic jams for wide-open skies and the creaking rhythm of a farmhouse, he believed he was stepping into a quieter world. The 36-year-old former chef, whose hands were more used to slicing through thick cuts of meat than nailing planks together, poured himself into rebuilding the abandoned farmstead he had purchased in Montana. It was not grand, nor was it particularly pretty to the eye, at least not yet, but it was his. The centerpiece of the land was a heavy, aging barn that Jake had restored with months of grueling labor, his knuckles scraped raw, his back aching from lifting weather-warped beams back into place. Inside that barn he had begun to keep a handful of cattle, including one very particular resident, Brazier, a massive temperamental bull with a body like a freight train and a mind of his own. Brazier was not just an animal to Jake. He was a presence, a force of nature contained only by reinforced wooden walls and heavy steel bolts Jake had installed by hand. At first, Jake had been charmed by the locals' polite distance. The neighboring farms sprawled over the rolling fields, each home tucked far enough away that you could forget you even had neighbors if you wanted to. It suited Jake perfectly. He wasn't antisocial, but he prized his privacy, valued the hard-earned solitude that city life had never granted him. That illusion, however, cracked almost immediately upon meeting Karen Hammond, his nearest neighbor. Karen was hard to ignore. She was a large woman in every sense of the word, loud, wide, and brimming with the kind of energy that bulldozed over any sense of personal space. She appeared one afternoon while Jake was setting up a new fence line, her voice cutting through the peaceful air like a chainsaw, carrying a stack of hastily printed documents and a plastic tumbler filled with sweet tea sloshing dangerously at the brim. Karen introduced herself with a handshake that was more of a shove, her words tumbling out in a torrent before Jake could get a word in. She spoke of property lines and old deeds, referencing some map her late uncle had supposedly drawn by hand decades ago, claiming that Jake's barn, and more crucially the land it sat on, was actually hers. Jake listened politely, setting down his hammer and wiping his hands on his jeans. But his patience wore thin as Karen continued to insist that the old barn had been improperly sited, stealing vital airflow and shade from her prized orchard trees. Jake tried explaining that he had verified all the boundaries when he purchased the property, had walked the lines with a surveyor, had filed all the necessary paperwork with the county. Karen brushed off his explanations with a dismissive wave, declaring that, "What's on paper ain't always what's right," a phrase she repeated like a personal mantra over the coming weeks. It would have been easy to write Karen off as another eccentric neighbor with too much free time and too little respect for facts. But she was persistent in ways Jake had not anticipated. She began to show up uninvited, walking the fence line with a scowl on her face, muttering to herself as she glared at the barn. She left notes stuffed into Jake's mailbox, sometimes scribbled warnings about violations, sometimes photocopies of old black-and-white photos of the land that she claimed proved her ownership, though they showed little more than patches of scrubland and a rusted tractor. Jake responded at first with polite refusals and offers to meet formally to discuss the matter, but Karen always declined, saying she didn't need no big city lawyers poking their noses where they didn't belong. Jake might have tolerated the intrusion if it had stopped there. He had come to the countryside expecting to deal with wildlife, storms, and hard winters, not neighborly disputes over ghost property claims. But it did not stop. Karen's tactics grew more aggressive, more invasive. One morning, Jake woke to find the eastern gate leading to his barn forced open. The heavy latch splintered, as if someone had swung a crowbar against it repeatedly. There were boot prints in the mud, large, deep prints too heavy for a casual hiker. Jake repaired the gate without complaint, chalking it up to drunken trespassers. But the next week it happened again. This time, Jake found an old rusted padlock, snapped and thrown carelessly into the grass nearby, and a note taped to the barn door. "Move your crap or I will." Something inside Jake shifted then, something cold and heavy settling deep in his gut. This was not random mischief. It was a message, crude and clear. Karen was escalating, and if she was bold enough to break property and leave notes, she might eventually get bolder still. Jake knew better than to engage directly. He had no interest in shouting matches or physical confrontations that could escalate out of control. Instead, he quietly took steps to protect himself. He installed discreet cameras on the perimeters of his barn and house, small enough to blend into the beams and tree trunks. He reinforced the barn doors with hidden internal crossbars, designed not just to keep Brazier inside, but to prevent anyone else from getting in easily. He contacted a local attorney specializing in rural property disputes, preparing a legal foundation to respond if Karen ever tried to bring her threats into a courtroom. He said nothing to Karen about these precautions. Let her think he was just another clueless city boy playing at being a farmer. Let her underestimate him. Still, Jake found himself lying awake more nights than he cared to admit, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the creaks and moans of the old house settling around him. Every gust of wind became the imagined footfall of a trespasser. Every rustle of leaves outside the window made him sit up, heart hammering, straining to hear more. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the gnawing awareness that he was no longer entirely safe on his own land, that the boundary he had paid for, that he had fought to restore, was no longer respected. It reached a boiling point one muggy evening in late August. Jake was unloading hay bales into the barn, the sweat running down his back in rivulets despite the falling sun, when he saw a movement at the edge of his property. There, standing by the cracked old boundary fence, was Karen. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and a loose floral dress that billowed around her like a ship's sail. In her hands, she clutched something heavy, a massive sledgehammer, its battered head glinting dully in the fading light. She wasn't alone. Two men Jake didn't recognize, both built like beer-bellied football fans, hovered nearby, pretending to examine the fence but clearly watching him out of the corners of their eyes. Karen caught Jake's gaze and grinned, a wide, toothy expression that held no friendliness at all. She raised the sledgehammer slightly, almost in greeting, then turned and stalked toward the barn, the men lumbering after her. Jake didn't move at first. His body felt frozen, not in fear, but in that sudden, heavy stillness that comes just before a dangerous moment crests into action. His mind raced, calculating distances, obstacles, outcomes. Brazier, he knew, was inside the barn, resting in the cool shade, growing restless after a day penned up from the heat. The barn doors were latched, but if Karen tried to force them open, if she broke through, Jake moved quickly but deliberately, setting down the hay bale and grabbing the heavy wooden staff he kept by the barn entrance, a tool for guiding cattle, but one that would serve just as well for other purposes. He stepped forward, placing himself between Karen and the barn. Every muscle in his body tensed. Karen didn't stop. She hefted the sledgehammer higher, shifting her grip, her breath coming in short, angry huffs as she approached. "You're trespassing," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "You need to turn around. Now." Karen laughed, a loud, ugly sound that echoed off the trees. "This ain't your land," she spat, jabbing the sledgehammer at the barn. "That barn's on my lot. Always has been. I'm just taking back what's mine." Jake didn't argue. Words weren't going to matter now. He stood his ground as Karen advanced, the two men flanking her with uncertain expressions. They hadn't brought weapons, at least none visible, but their size alone made them a potential threat. Karen raised the hammer higher, stepping closer, her face flushed and slick with sweat. Jake gripped the staff tighter, ready to block if she swung. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to be forced into violence on his own land. But he wasn't going to let them break through to Brazier, wasn't going to let them breach the one place he had carved out for himself with his own sweat and stubbornness. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, Karen lunged forward, swinging the sledgehammer in a clumsy, furious arc directly at the barn door. And inside, something stirred. Something heavy. Something that had been waiting. Brazier let out a deep guttural bellow that vibrated through the ground itself, and the barn walls seemed to tremble in response. Jake smiled grimly. Karen had no idea what she was about to unleash. The moment the sledgehammer struck the barn door, Brazier reacted with the unstoppable, primal force that only an animal of his size and temperament could muster. There was a sharp crack as the wood splintered under the first blow, a second of stunned silence from everyone outside, and then the barn shuddered as something massive slammed into it from the inside. Karen barely had time to recoil before the heavy door, reinforced with bolts and crossbars but weakened by the hammer's strike, buckled outward with a groan of tortured hinges. Brazer's horned head drove against the wood again, and this time the door gave way with an explosive crack, swinging outward with enough force to knock Karen off balance. The bull surged forward, massive shoulders forcing their way through the fractured opening, his deep chest heaving with each furious breath. Brazer's eyes, dark and wild, locked instantly on the unfamiliar figures before him. To an animal bred to guard, defend, and react to intrusion, the scene was not one of confusion, but of immediate threat. He pawed the ground once, lowering his head slightly, and let out a sound that was less a bellow and more a rumbling growl from deep within his chest. Karen, for all her bravado, shrieked in terror and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the hem of her billowing dress. The two men, who had until that moment played the part of Karen's silent backup, froze for a split second, their faces pale and wide-eyed. Then, self-preservation instinct overrode whatever loyalty they had to Karen's cause, and they bolted, turning heel and sprinting across the field without a single glance back. Karen tried to follow, but her bulk and the uneven ground betrayed her. She slipped in the mud, falling heavily onto her side with a grunt, her sledgehammer slipping from her grip and landing several feet away. Jake stayed perfectly still. He knew Brazer, knew how to handle him. Quick movements, loud noises, those would only provoke the bull further. Slowly, without turning his head, Jake reached out and grasped the emergency lead rope coiled on a nearby fence post. Brazer snorted, shaking his massive head, but he did not immediately charge. For now, the chaos of the broken door and the sudden flight of the intruders seemed to have disoriented him just enough to buy Jake a precious few seconds. Karen, however, had no sense of animal behavior. She flailed in the mud, struggling to push herself up, her voice rising in a shrill screech that only aggravated Brazer more. The bull's ears flicked forward, his nostrils flaring, and he took two slow, deliberate steps toward the source of the noise. Jake saw the warning signs clear as day, the way Brazer's muscles bunched under his hide, the way his body angled for a charge. "Stay down!" Jake barked, his voice sharp and commanding, cutting through Karen's panicked shrieking. "Don't move! Don't yell!" But Karen did the exact opposite. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed for the sledgehammer, and swung it in a wild, defensive arc, not toward Jake, but blindly in Brazer's direction. That was all the provocation the bull needed. With a thunderous snort, Brazer lunged. Jake moved fast. He uncoiled the lead rope with practiced hands and stepped between Karen and Brazer, swinging the rope in a wide arc. The thick end cracked sharply through the air, a command Brazer recognized instantly from their training sessions. The bull faltered mid-charge, skidding slightly in the muddy earth, his hooves churning up clumps of sod. He shook his head furiously but halted his advance. Using the momentary break in momentum, Jake approached Brazer sideways, avoiding direct eye contact, speaking in low, steady tones. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his movements deliberate, controlled. Slowly, carefully, he looped the rope over Brazer's thick neck, securing it just behind the horns. The bull resisted at first, tossing his head, but Jake braced his boots in the mud and held firm, using gentle pressure and calming words to guide the massive animal away from the crumpled form of Karen. Once Brazer was tethered, Jake led him back toward the interior of the barn, maneuvering through the splintered remains of the door. It wasn't ideal. There was no real door left to secure the bull behind, but Jake managed to coax Brazer into one of the interior pens and bolted the heavy gate shut with a metal latch that would hold, at least temporarily. When Jake finally turned back to the yard, Karen was still there, hunched over and gasping, her clothes soaked with mud and her face a mask of rage and humiliation. She was bruised but otherwise unharmed. Jake walked toward her with measured steps, careful to keep his own fury in check. "You need to leave," he said, his voice cold. "Right now." Karen glared at him, chest heaving, her hands trembling. For a moment, Jake thought she might actually try to argue, to protest. But then she saw the gathering figures in the distance. Neighbors who had heard the commotion and now stood at the edges of their properties, watching in silent judgment. Karen swore under her breath, picked up her mud-caked sledgehammer with effort, and limped toward her car, parked haphazardly along the side of the road. She slammed the door so hard the vehicle rocked on its suspension, then gunned the engine and tore off down the dirt road, leaving a trail of dust in her wake. Jake stood alone for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from his veins, leaving behind a deep, pulsing exhaustion. He knew better than to think this was over. Karen was humiliated, and humiliation could be a dangerous fuel for people like her. She wouldn't let this go. She would find another way to strike back, something nastier, something less direct. As the neighbors began to drift away, pretending they hadn't been watching, Jake knelt beside the damaged barn door, running his fingers over the splintered wood. This wasn't just vandalism. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute gone sour. This was a clear, calculated escalation. Karen had come onto his property with a weapon and accomplices, had attempted to break into his barn, and had endangered not only herself, but his animals and anyone else within range, if Brazier had gotten loose. Jake knew what he had to do next. Moving with purpose, he retrieved his phone from the barn office and dialed the number of his attorney, a wiry, sharp-minded man named Stephen Caldwell, who specialized in property defense. Stephen picked up on the second ring, his voice brisk and no-nonsense. "Stephen, it's Jake Hart," he said without preamble. "We have a situation." As Jake detailed the evening's events, he could almost hear Stephen taking notes on the other end, the scratch of pen against paper faint but steady. "She brought a weapon onto your land and attempted forced entry," Stephen said when Jake finished. "And she had witnesses. That's not just trespassing. That's criminal mischief at minimum, maybe aggravated trespass if we push it." Jake didn't care about the legal terminology. He cared about results. "What do I need to do?" he asked. "I'll file a no-contact order first thing in the morning," Stephen said, "and we'll document everything. Photos of the damage, statements from any neighbors willing to corroborate what happened. If she tries anything again, we'll be ready. For now, secure your property as best you can. Do not engage with her directly." Jake thanked him, hung up, and went to work. He photographed the barn door from every angle, including close-ups of the splintered wood, the muddy footprints, and the broken latch. He recorded a video walking the perimeter, narrating the events in a calm, factual tone. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. It was insurance against whatever Karen decided to throw at him next. Hours later, long after the last light faded from the sky, Jake sat on the front porch of his house, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hands. The barn loomed in the distance, battered but still standing. Brazier's low grunts carried faintly through the night air, a steady, reassuring sound. Jake stared out into the darkness, his mind sharp despite the weight of exhaustion dragging at his limbs. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let someone like Karen Hammond bully him off his own land. She had crossed a line tonight, a line from which there was no easy retreat. He didn't know what her next move would be, but whatever it was, Jake Hart would be ready. Jake spent the next few days reinforcing everything he could. Sleep came in short, restless fragments, and when it did, it brought images of Brazier breaking free, of Karen smashing windows, of fire licking up the sides of the barn. He worked from dawn until well after sunset, strengthening the new door with iron braces, installing extra locks on the house and the storage sheds, and stringing additional wire fencing around the paddocks. There was no room for complacency now. Karen had shown that she was willing to cross lines most people wouldn't even approach, and Jake knew the worst thing he could do would be to underestimate her stubbornness. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about pride, spite, and the refusal to admit defeat. Stephen Caldwell moved quickly. Within 48 hours, a formal cease and desist order had been filed against Karen, citing trespassing, destruction of private property, and endangerment of livestock. A copy was delivered to her mailbox by a professional process server, a tall, no-nonsense woman who took the opportunity to snap a few photographs of Karen's reaction for the file. According to Stephen, Karen had snatched the papers out of the woman's hand, thrown them to the ground, and screamed something unintelligible before slamming her front door so hard it rattled the windows. Jake hoped that would be the end of it, but deep down, he knew better. People like Karen didn't just fade away when they were cornered. They thrashed and clawed and looked for new ways to strike back. The retaliation began subtly. It started with strange, anonymous complaints filed with the county agricultural office. First, there were accusations that Jake was operating an illegal livestock operation without proper permits. Then someone reported him for alleged water theft, claiming he was siphoning off resources meant for communal use. Each complaint required Jake to produce documentation, inspections, and statements, eating up hours of his time and grinding his nerves raw. None of the claims held up under scrutiny, but that wasn't the point. The goal was to bleed him dry through inconvenience and frustration, to force him into a mistake that could be exploited. Jake refused to take the bait. Every inspection he welcomed with calm professionalism, walking the agents through his paperwork, showing them the carefully labeled files he kept for every aspect of his operation. He kept his cool even when one inspector, clearly embarrassed, apologized and muttered something about crazy neighbors with too much time on their hands. Jake just nodded and kept his mouth shut. Let Karen show her hand. He wasn't going to give her any easy wins. Then came the vandalism. It started small. A slashed tire on his pickup truck one morning, a broken side mirror left dangling by a wire, a trail of garbage dumped across his driveway, filled with rotting food and rusted cans. One night, Jake came home from town to find that someone had opened all the gates around the property, letting his cattle wander dangerously close to the road. Fortunately, he caught it in time, rounding up the animals with Brazier leading the reluctant herd back toward safety. Jake documented everything, photographing each incident, saving security footage, filing police reports where necessary. The sheriff's deputies were polite but non-committal. Rural crime, they said, was notoriously hard to prosecute without witnesses or smoking gun evidence. Jake could see in their eyes the truth. They sympathized, but they weren't going to stick their necks out over a neighbor dispute, especially not one involving someone like Karen, who had lived in the community for years and undoubtedly had friends in low places. Through it all, Jake maintained a stoic facade. He smiled at the inspectors, waved at the sheriff's deputies, and spent his nights triple-checking the locks and sitting on his porch with a shotgun resting across his lap. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was simply refusing to surrender. It was during one of those long, tense evenings that he noticed something new. While walking the perimeter with a flashlight, checking for new damage or signs of tampering, Jake found a patch of disturbed earth near the south fence line. Kneeling down, he brushed away the loose soil and uncovered what at first seemed like just another piece of discarded trash, a stained cloth rag. But when he picked it up, the strong chemical odor hit him immediately, burning his nostrils. It was a smell he recognized from years ago when he had volunteered at a friend's farm during calving season. Pheromone lures, used to manipulate livestock behavior during breeding. Someone had soaked the rag with it and tossed it near the fence, where Brazier and the other cattle would catch the scent. Jake's stomach turned as the implications settled in. This wasn't just petty vandalism anymore. Someone was trying to provoke the animals, to create chaos or injury that could be pinned on him. If Brazier had gotten riled up, if he had broken through the fence or injured another animal, Jake could have faced serious legal and financial repercussions. And there was no doubt in his mind who was behind it. The next morning, Jake delivered the rag to Stephen's office in a sealed evidence bag. Stephen's reaction was grim but unsurprised. "This is escalation," he said simply, sliding the bag into a drawer for safekeeping. "Keep everything. We're building a record. Eventually she'll make a mistake big enough we can bury her legally." Jake nodded but said nothing. His anger was past the boiling point now. It had cooled into something harder, more focused. 2 nights later, Karen made her next move. Jake had just finished evening chores and was sitting down to a late dinner when a knock sounded at the front door. He frowned, wiping his hands on a towel as he approached. Visitors at this hour were rare, and unwelcome ones even more so. When he opened the door, he found a man standing there, a short, balding figure in a rumpled suit jacket and khaki pants. He carried a clipboard and a forced, oily smile. "Good evening, Mr. Hart," the man said, flipping open the clipboard. "Name's Douglas Finch. I'm here on behalf of the Regional Property Assessment Board." Jake raised an eyebrow. "This late?" Yes, well, due to staffing shortages, we're conducting some assessments outside of regular hours," Finch said smoothly. "It's come to our attention that there may be unauthorized structures or modifications on your property. Just routine stuff. Mind if I take a quick look around?" Jake didn't move from the doorway. His instincts screamed at him to shut the door and call Stephen immediately. But instead, he kept his expression neutral and said, "Show me your ID." Finch hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Jake smiled thinly. "I'll wait." After an awkward pause, Finch produced a laminated card from his jacket pocket. Jake took it, studying it carefully. It looked legitimate at a glance, but the logo was slightly off-center, and the print quality was suspiciously poor. "Wait here," Jake said, stepping back inside. He grabbed his phone from the counter and dialed the number for the actual regional property office. After a few minutes on hold, a tired-sounding woman confirmed his suspicion. No one named Douglas Finch worked for them, and they weren't conducting any after-hours assessments. Jake hung up and returned to the door, tossing the fake ID back at Finch's chest. "You've got about 10 seconds to get off my property before I call the sheriff," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. Finch blanched, mumbling something about misunderstandings, and practically sprinted back to a battered sedan parked down the road. Jake watched as the car sped away, its tires throwing up a rooster tail of dust. He called Stephen immediately and filed another report. By now, the file against Karen was thick enough to choke a horse, but without a direct link to her or a smoking gun, the case remained circumstantial. Jake didn't care. He wasn't building his defense for the court of law. He was building it for the court of survival, and he intended to win. The morning after the fake inspector incident, Jake woke up to an eerie stillness hanging over the property. It wasn't the calm, welcoming silence he had once associated with life in the countryside. It was the kind of heavy, unnatural quiet that made your skin crawl and kept your muscles coiled tight, ready for something to go wrong. His first instinct was to check the barn, to make sure Brazier and the rest of the cattle were safe, and he moved through the house quickly, grabbing his boots and jacket, slipping outside without even bothering to pour a cup of coffee. The fields stretched out before him in the early dawn light, coated in a thin mist that blurred the edges of everything. The barn, solid and square, stood where it should be, but something about the scene felt off. As Jake approached, his boots crunching through the gravel path, he spotted the first sign that something was wrong. The side gate to the barn, which he always kept locked with a heavy chain, was hanging open, the chain lying in the dirt like a discarded snake. His heart rate spiked, but his movement stayed deliberate, cautious. He unclipped the small flashlight from his belt and swept it across the ground, searching for disturbances. The gravel around the entrance was scuffed and churned up, clear evidence that someone had been there, and not just briefly. As he stepped closer, the beam of light caught something else, scraps of fabric, pale and torn, hanging from the splintered remnants of a burlap sack. Inside the barn, Brazier let out a deep, restless grunt. Jake exhaled slowly, reassured by the sound, but the tension in his body didn't ease. He stepped through the door, his eyes adjusting quickly to the dimness, and found Brazier pacing inside his pen, nostrils flaring, head tossing from side to side. At first glance, there was no obvious damage, no sign of injury, but Jake knew animals too well to mistake Brazier's agitation for something minor. He approached carefully, speaking low, and scanned the area for anything out of place. In the corner of the pen, half hidden under a loose pile of straw, he found it. A ripped-open feed sack, its contents fouled with a strange gritty powder that gave off a pungent chemical smell. Jake backed away immediately, pulling out his phone and snapping photos from a distance. He didn't know exactly what the substance was, but he knew enough to guess it wasn't meant for animal consumption. Whether it was a simple irritant meant to drive the bull crazy, or something more malicious designed to sicken or kill him, it didn't matter. The intent was clear. Sabotage. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed Stephen Caldwell's number, but his voice remained steady when the lawyer answered. "Someone tried to poison the stock," Jake said without preamble. "I'm sending you pictures." Stephen's response was crisp and immediate. "Don't touch anything else. I'll have an investigator out there within the hour. Do not engage with anyone. Keep the animals secure and stay visible." Jake followed the instructions to the letter. He moved Brazier and the other cattle into the rear paddock, locking them inside with fresh, uncontaminated feed and water. Then, he sat on the front porch, shotgun across his knees, waiting. True to his word, Stephen's investigator arrived within the hour. A quiet, no-nonsense woman named Rachel Voss, who worked private security for high-risk rural properties. She moved with the detached efficiency of someone who had seen worse, taking samples of the powder, photographing the scene in meticulous detail, marking tire tracks and footprints in the dirt. As she worked, Jake explained everything he had noticed: the missing chain, the disturbed gravel, the ripped burlap, and Rachel listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding and jotting notes in a battered leather notebook. "This wasn't random," she said when she finished. "Someone planned this. They knew where your feed was stored. They knew how to get in and out without making too much noise. Amateurs don't bring chemical agents." Jake clenched his fists. He wanted to punch something, to shout, to grab Karen Hammond by the collar and drag her in front of a judge, but he knew better. Rage would accomplish nothing. He needed evidence. He needed patience. Rachel packed up her samples carefully. "I'll have the lab results in a couple days. In the meantime, I'd suggest installing motion sensors and additional cameras around your feed storage. Whoever did this isn't finished." Jake nodded grimly. He would not be caught off guard again. That evening, as he installed new security lights and adjusted camera angles, a battered pickup truck rolled slowly down the road toward his property. Jake watched from the shadows, heart hammering in his chest, as the truck slowed even further when it reached his driveway. Behind the wheel, he recognized Karen's broad figure, her face partially obscured by dark sunglasses and a scowl. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Jake felt the unmistakable weight of her hatred. She said nothing, did nothing, just let the truck idle there for a few long, tense seconds before stepping on the gas and disappearing into the dusk. It was a warning, he knew. A message. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. The next morning brought the next escalation. Jake woke to the sound of barking, frantic, high-pitched, panicked, and bolted upright, throwing on clothes as he rushed outside. The source of the noise was immediately clear. A dog, small and wiry, trapped inside the main cattle paddock, running in terrified circles as Brazier bellowed and stomped, agitated by the intruder. Jake vaulted the fence, moving fast, speaking soothing words to Brazier even as he maneuvered between the bull and the panicked dog. After a tense few minutes, he managed to corner the dog against the far fence and scoop it up, cradling the trembling animal in his arms as he retreated to safety. Only once he was clear did he notice the tag on the dog's collar. It wasn't a neighbor's pet. It bore the name and address of a local shelter, and tied around the collar was a strip of red fabric, a crude attempt at a lure, likely soaked in the same chemical irritants they had found near the feed. Jake's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Someone, Karen, had gone so far as to weaponize an innocent animal, counting on the chaos, the potential injury, the possibility that Brazier would be blamed for mauling a helpless dog. It was a tactic so cruel, so calculated, that for a moment Jake was genuinely stunned, but only for a moment. He called the shelter immediately, explained the situation, and drove the dog back himself, making sure to document every step of the process. The shelter manager, a kindly woman named Marcy, was horrified and promised to report the incident to the authorities. It wasn't much, but it was another brick in the growing wall of evidence against Karen Hammond. Jake returned home that afternoon feeling more exhausted than ever, but also more determined. Karen had crossed into dangerous territory, not just for him, but for the animal she claimed to love so much. Her attacks were no longer just personal. They were reckless, putting everything and everyone at risk. That night, Jake stood by the barn under the stars, watching the fields stretch out into darkness, listening to the soft, heavy breathing of the cattle in their pens. He knew the fight wasn't over. If anything, it was only beginning. Karen would escalate again. She would push harder, grow more desperate. But so would he. Jake Hart had survived betrayal, exhaustion, and hardship before. He knew how to outlast storms. And when Karen Hammond came for him again, he would be ready. The days that followed passed with a tense waiting quality, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Jake moved through the farm with his usual diligence, tending to repairs, reinforcing fences, checking locks and gates twice, 3 times a day. But he felt it in his bones. That brittle charge in the air, the certainty that the storm wasn't over, only gathering strength. Karen Hammond had gone too far to simply back down now, and Jake knew better than to mistake temporary silence for surrender. He spent his nights sleeping lightly, shotgun propped against the wall, boots by the bed, ready to move at the first wrong sound. The cameras he had installed caught nothing unusual beyond a few deer and the occasional coyote, but Jake could feel eyes on his property, could feel the weight of Karen's hatred pressing against the boundary lines she so despised. It was a Saturday evening when the next blow came, not with the stealth of poisoned feed or the cowardice of staged accidents, but with raw violence. Jake had just finished securing the livestock for the night, walking the paddocks one last time, when the distinct scent of smoke reached him, sharp and acrid, cutting through the clean country air like a knife. His stomach lurched even before he turned and saw it, a thin, twisting column of black rising into the sky from the far end of the field, near the old storage shed where he kept spare hay bales and broken fencing. Without thinking, Jake sprinted toward the source, boots pounding across the rough ground. As he crested the slight rise that separated the barn from the storage area, he saw the fire clearly. Flames licking hungrily up the side of the shed, already consuming the dry, brittle wood, heat warping the air in shimmering waves. For one horrifying moment, he thought the fire might jump the clearing and reach the barn itself, where Brazier and the other animals were penned in for the night. But then he remembered the fire breaks he had spent weeks carving into the landscape, wide, barren strips of gravel and packed dirt that now stood between the blaze and the heart of the farm. Jake didn't waste time cursing or panicking. He ran to the nearest pump station, grabbed the emergency hose and dragged it toward the fire, bracing himself against the recoil as he opened the valve and sent a high-pressure jet of water into the flames. It was a losing battle. The shed was too far gone to save, but Jake's goal wasn't to rescue the structure. It was to contain the fire, to stop it from spreading any farther. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, summoned by a neighbor who had seen the smoke from half a mile away, Jake had the worst of it under control. The firefighters doused the smoldering wreckage, checked for hidden embers, and took down his statement with professional efficiency. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with soot smeared across his forehead, clapped Jake on the shoulder and muttered, "You're lucky you caught it when you did. With this dry season, your whole spread could have gone up." Jake thanked him, but inside he was boiling. Luck had nothing to do with it. This was arson, pure and simple, and he had no doubt who had lit the match. Once the last of the firefighters had left, Jake returned to the blackened remains of the shed, picking through the wreckage carefully. The fire inspector would arrive in the morning to conduct a formal investigation, but Jake was determined to see for himself if there were any clues. Amid the twisted, charred ruins, he found it. A crumpled canister, half melted but still recognizable as a standard accelerant container, the kind used for lighter fluid or cheap gasoline. Nearby he spotted something else. A fragment of red fabric, almost identical to the strip he had found tied to the shelter dog's collar days before. He photographed everything, careful not to disturb the scene further, and sent the images to Stephen with a terse message. "Arson, evidence secured. Karen's handiwork." The lawyer's response was immediate. "Do not engage. Investigator en route. Keep the animals locked and cameras rolling." Jake obeyed, but his patience was nearing its breaking point. He spent the rest of the night patrolling the property, a grim specter moving through the shadows, shotgun slung over one shoulder, flashlight slicing through the dark. His mind raced with contingencies, worst-case scenarios, defensive plans. Karen was escalating not just in spite, but in desperation. That made her more dangerous than ever. The next attack came 2 nights later, but this time it wasn't fire or poison. It was legal, or at least cloaked in the thin veneer of legality. Jake was repairing a section of fence along the northern boundary when a county sheriff's deputy pulled up in a dusty patrol truck, climbed out, and handed Jake a thick sheaf of papers. Jake took them silently, flipping through the pages as the deputy explained in clipped, uncomfortable tones that Karen had filed a restraining order against him, citing harassment, intimidation, and endangerment. Jake nearly laughed aloud at the absurdity of it. Harassment? He hadn't set foot on her property. Intimidation? If anything, she had been the aggressor at every turn. Endangerment? The only lives she had endangered were those of his animals and his own. But the restraining order wasn't about facts. It was about tying his hands, forcing him into a defensive posture, making him look guilty in the eyes of any casual observer who didn't know the full story. Jake thanked the deputy without complaint and called Stephen the moment the truck disappeared down the road. The lawyer was furious, not at Jake, but at the tactic. It was a classic move in rural property disputes. Bury your opponent under enough paperwork and allegations that they couldn't breathe, let alone fight back. "We'll counterfile," Stephen said immediately. "We have the evidence. The trespassing, the vandalism, the attempted poisoning, the arson. You're not the one under threat here. She is." That evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by copies of every police report, every photograph, every written statement and notarized affidavit Stephen had assembled. It was a wall of truth, solid and undeniable. Karen could scream and lie and manipulate all she wanted. The evidence would outlast her noise. But the legal battle would take time, and Jake knew he couldn't afford to let down his guard in the meantime. The following week passed in a strange, tense rhythm. Jake maintained his routines with iron discipline, waking before dawn, tending to the animals, inspecting the property, filing every small incident with Stephen's office. Karen kept her distance physically, perhaps warned off by the looming legal storm. But her presence was felt in other ways. Anonymous complaints continued to pour into county offices. Jake's mail was tampered with. Strange vehicles loitered near his driveway late at night, engines idling before disappearing into the dark. Jake responded the only way he knew how. He tightened security even further, added more cameras, posted warning signs along the property line, and began documenting every vehicle that slowed near his land. He refused to engage directly, refused to give Karen or her cronies any excuse to escalate the conflict beyond what it already was. One night, long after sunset, Jake sat on the porch, rifle resting against the railing. Brazer's low, contented breathing drifting through the night from the barn. The moon hung low and heavy over the fields, casting everything in silver and shadow. Jake sipped black coffee from a battered enamel mug and watched the tree line. He knew they would come again. He knew this wasn't over. But he was ready, and he would not lose. It happened on a night when the wind rolled hard across the fields, shaking the trees and sending long fingers of dust dancing through the air. Jake sat as he always did, stationed on the porch with a rifle by his side and a lantern casting a dim circle of light around him. Every night had felt like a test of endurance, but this one carried a different weight, a pressure that seemed to pulse through the ground itself. His instincts, those honed over months of living under siege, prickled with warning. Somewhere out in the blackness, a line was about to be crossed for the final time. It started with the low hum of an engine idling beyond the curve of the dirt road. Jake set down his coffee slowly and rose to his feet, every muscle coiled tight with anticipation. From the dark, two figures emerged. Heavy, lumbering shapes moving fast and low, darting across the open field toward the barn. They carried something between them, a bundle too angular to be anything natural, and even from a distance, Jake knew exactly what it was. Canisters of accelerant. They had come to finish what they had started before, but this time they weren't aiming for a shed. They were coming for the barn itself, for Brazier, for everything Jake had built and bled for. He didn't call out. He didn't fire a warning shot. He moved like a shadow, slipping down from the porch and crossing the yard with long, silent strides. The ground was hard-packed from drought, giving him a quiet path as he circled wide, approaching the barn from the opposite side. The men worked quickly, dousing the outer walls with the flammable liquid, laughing under their breath, too absorbed in their crime to notice the figure moving closer. Then, from the other side of the barn, a third figure appeared, shorter, bulkier, with that unmistakable lumbering gait Jake had come to recognize in his nightmares. Karen Hammond herself, carrying a flare, the bright orange stick already spitting sparks into the night air. She waved it like a banner, her face twisted into an expression of triumph and hate, and with a roar she hurled it toward the barn wall soaked in fuel. Jake moved. He broke from the cover of the trees, sprinting full tilt toward the flare. In a single desperate lunge, he caught it out of the air with his gloved hand, the heat searing through the leather but not enough to stop him. He hurled the flare into the dirt, grinding it under his boot until the sparks died with a hiss. The men froze, startled by his sudden appearance, and for one taut heartbeat, the world balanced on a knife's edge. Then Karen screamed, a wordless, furious sound, and ordered them to attack. Jake stood his ground as the first man charged, swinging a length of pipe like a club. He sidestepped the clumsy blow easily, driving the butt of his rifle into the man's gut with a practiced twist. The man crumpled with a choked grunt, falling heavily to the ground. The second hesitated, then lunged, but Jake was ready, swinging the rifle up into a defensive block, then ramming his shoulder into the attacker's chest, sending him sprawling. Karen, for all her bluster, did not join the fight. She stood back, red-faced and trembling, screaming threats and curses into the night. Jake ignored her. He cuffed the two men with zip ties he pulled from his belt, a habit he'd picked up after weeks of dealing with sabotage, and shoved them face first into the dirt. Lights appeared on the horizon, headlights bouncing over the rough road. The cavalry had arrived, summoned by Jake's silent alarm system that had triggered the moment the intruders crossed the second fence line. It wasn't much, just a few deputies from the county sheriff's office, but it was enough. Karen saw the lights and turned to run, but she wasn't built for speed. Jake caught her easily, grabbing her by the arm and wrenching the flare from her grasp before she could do any more damage. She swung at him, fat fists flailing, but he held her at arm's length, breathing hard, not from the exertion, but from the restraint it took not to return the blows. When the deputies arrived, it didn't take long to piece the story together. Jake had video footage from half a dozen angles, showing Karen and her hired thugs dousing his barn in accelerant. He had the evidence of the attempted arson, the previous sabotage, the poisoning attempts. The deputies listened, looked at the footage, examined the bruised and groaning men on the ground, and slapped the cuffs on Karen without ceremony. "You're under arrest for attempted arson, conspiracy, trespassing, and reckless endangerment," the senior deputy said as he guided her toward the patrol car. Karen shrieked and kicked, bellowing about her rights, about her property, about how she was the real victim, but no one listened. Jake leaned against the fence, watching her flail, feeling nothing but a deep, exhausted satisfaction. The deputies loaded the men into a second cruiser, and within minutes, the farm was quiet again, save for the occasional crackle of the radios and the low murmur of professional voices confirming charges. Jake gave his statement calmly, factually, refusing to be drawn into anger or speculation. He presented his evidence, answered their questions, and when it was done, he shook the deputy's hand and watched them drive away, taillights disappearing into the darkness. Brazier let out a low, questioning grunt from the barn, and Jake smiled tiredly, walking over to scratch the bull's massive head through the bars of the pen. "It's over, buddy," he said softly. "We held the line." That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Jake slept without fear. The weeks that followed unfolded in slow, deliberate strokes, as if the entire world around Jake was finally exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Karen Hammond, once the looming specter at the edge of every sunrise and the source of every shadowed doubt, was gone. She faced multiple charges, and although the wheels of rural justice turned slower than Jake would have liked, they turned nonetheless. The county judge, an old rancher himself who had no patience for property disputes that turned violent, made it clear during the preliminary hearings that Karen's antics would not be treated lightly. Out on bail, but under strict restrictions, she was barred from coming within 500 feet of Jake's land, prohibited from contacting him or anyone associated with his property, and stripped of the last shreds of credibility she had once clung to. In the community, her arrest had been the final crack in her already shaky reputation. Word spread quickly in small towns, and by the time Jake made his first trip back into town for supplies, the shift was palpable. Neighbors who once kept their distance out of wariness now greeted him with cautious nods and occasional words of support. At the feed store, the owner quietly slipped Jake a discount, muttering something about standing up to bullies. At the diner, the waitress who had once served Karen's loud demands with fake smiles now poured Jake's coffee without waiting to be asked, leaving the pot at his table with a wink. Jake accepted these small kindnesses with quiet gratitude but kept his focus steady. His trust, once damaged, was not easily repaired, and he had no intention of letting the farm or his life slip back into the easy rhythms that had once left him vulnerable. He continued to reinforce the property, installing a new reinforced gate with an automatic locking system at the entrance to his drive, and adding another layer of fencing around the main structures. He replaced the destroyed shed with a sturdier fireproof outbuilding, one that stood as a symbol of survival rather than loss. Every beam he lifted, every post he set into the ground was a statement. "I am still here, "I will not be moved." Brazier, ever the steady guardian, seemed to sense the change as well. He settled back into his routines, his powerful frame a familiar, comforting presence in the fields. In the cool hours of the early morning, Jake would sometimes find the bull standing quietly at the top of the rise, watching over the land with a calm vigilance that mirrored Jake's own. The bond between them had deepened during the months of conflict, forged not just in shared space, but in shared endurance. Jake had protected Brazier, and in return, Brazier had stood as a living wall between the farm and the chaos outside. The lawsuit filed by Jake's attorney moved forward methodically, building on the mountain of evidence collected over the long campaign of harassment. Stephen was confident, predicting a settlement that would cover the damages and legal fees. But Jake cared less about the money than about the principle. He had fought not just for his home, but for the right to live in peace, to stake a claim and defend it against the kind of petty malice that too often went unchecked. In late autumn, as the leaves turned brittle and gold under the hard blue sky, the final judgment came down. Karen was found guilty on multiple counts, ordered to pay substantial restitution, and most importantly, permanently enjoined from any further contact with Jake or his property. Her land, heavily mortgaged and now financially devastated by the legal battles she had provoked, went into foreclosure within months. By winter, she had vanished from the county entirely, leaving behind nothing but rumors and a few broken fences. Jake watched her house sit empty, windows boarded, grass growing wild around the foundation, and felt nothing but relief. There was no triumph in it, no petty glee, only the clean, hard satisfaction of knowing that the land he had fought for was finally, truly his. That winter was the hardest Jake had faced since coming to the farm. Snow came early and stayed long, piling up against the fences, driving ice into every crack and seam. But he faced it the way he had faced everything else, with steady hands and a stubborn heart. He dug out paths to the barn each morning, breaking ice from the water troughs with an iron bar, hauling hay through waist-deep drifts. Brazier weathered the storms with the quiet resilience of the strong, huffing great clouds of steam into the freezing air as he moved through the white fields like a ship through rough seas. In those long, dark months, Jake found something he hadn't expected: peace. Not the naive peace he had imagined when he first bought the farm, but a harder, earned kind, forged through trial and defended with everything he had. The farm was no longer just a dream. It was a fact, a reality built board by board, defended inch by inch. And when spring came at last, breaking the frozen grip of winter with slow, tentative fingers of green, Jake stood on the porch of his house, the rebuilt barn solid and proud behind him, and let himself finally breathe easy. The land stretched out before him, quiet and strong, and he knew it was not just his to own, but his to protect. As for Karen Hammond, she became nothing more than a story, a warning told in low voices over beers at the diner or at the feed store, a ghost of anger and folly that had passed and left no lasting mark. Jake never spoke of her. He had no need. His life spoke for him. On a warm evening in late May, Jake hung a new sign on the gate, a small thing he had carved himself over the winter, rough-edged and simple. Hart Farm, private land, protected and defended. Beneath it, almost as an afterthought, he etched a crude outline of a bull's head, broad and strong, its horns raised in silent challenge. Brazier watched from the paddock, chewing thoughtfully on a mouthful of clover, and Jake tipped his hat to the bull with a grin. They had earned this land together, and no one was ever going to take it from them again.